Hello, everyone. I believe we can start. I hope you all hear me well. Welcome on my personal behalf, but also I think I can say on behalf of the Belgrade Security Forum. I'm very glad, honored, and pleased to chair this conversation hosted by the Belgrade Security Forum on an important topic, I think, mainstreaming right-wing extremism. Let me, just as a first word, have a word of thanks for the organizers on behalf of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, and to say that to thank them for the excellent cooperation. And then let me go straight into the topic, because we only have 1 hour and it's a complicated topic. Let me just give you a few words of introduction about the topic, and then an introduction of our distinguished speakers. So maybe I will start with a word of disambiguation, if I may call it like that, because when I received the panel program, I found that mainstreaming right-wing extremism is open to possible misunderstanding. So let me clarify. One understanding of the term, of course, is that we wish to mainstream right-wing extremism. And of course, this is emphatically not what we wish for. On the contrary, the panel has the opposite, I would say, aspiration. We take stock, we witness in the last few years, in the last decade especially, the phenomenon of themes and rhetorics and stances that were traditionally associated with the far right, and they were fringe components of our political system. We witnessed that becoming increasingly mainstream. We believe that there are significant problems in that, there are problematic aspects, and the purpose of the panel really is to understand why this is happening, and maybe to offer some ideas in terms of solutions. What should we do? What actions should be taken? In the way the debate has been framed, there are 3 issues which I think are relevant, 3 broad issues. They are distinct issues, but of course they are fed by the same sort of political environment. So let me briefly mention them. The first obvious one is the significant rise and electoral affirmation in right-wing identitarian nationalist parties that we have witnessed across the Western world during the last decade. They have been empowered, they are empowered in some European countries. They managed, if we consider Trump, for example, a figure of this type, they managed to take over the White House. So they are now at the heart of the most important democracy, if you want, of the Western world. And they have been one of the main drivers, as you know, of Brexit. I don't need to insist too much because we are all informed about that. Of course, so this is the first aspect, the great affirmation, electoral affirmation of this party, with all the consequences that the prominence of their rhetoric and their themes means for the rest of the political spectrum. The second aspect is the restructuring of political systems that is produced, because of course the rest of the political spectrum was also heavily reshaped. The themes that mainstream parties have been forced to deal with, the agenda had been partly influenced by the rise of these movements. And so we have seen center-right, but also center-left parties to an extent taking up, elements of rhetoric that we traditionally associated with the far right. Here, the example that always is made, and I think for good reasons, is the campaign of Mark Rutte in 2018. This is a very mainstream liberal leader, but clearly in an effort to counter the radical right, which was very strong in the Netherlands, he took over some identitarian themes that were dear to the radical right. The third distinct aspect is the rise in far-right inspired violence and political terrorism. And we know from the latest global terrorism index from 2019 that there has been a massive increase in far-right related inspired attacks. Some of them were very high profile. We all remember the dreadful Christchurch, for example, attack that killed over 50 people in New Zealand a couple of years ago. So these are the broad themes that we are going to address. Now, who are we? Who is going to address them? My name is Federico Ottavio Reho. I am the coordinator of research at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, which is the official think tank of the European People's Party in Brussels. And we have two distinguished speakers, which I now will introduce. So first, Sasha Havliček. Welcome, Sasha. So Sasha is the director and CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a London-based think and action tank, an organization in which she's primarily leading, if I understand correctly, the counter-extremism and foreign policy work. Well, Sasha has a very rich CV, which I cannot now entirely summarize, but she has been involved in a number of important working groups and networks. Let me mention that she co-chaired the EU's Internet Radicalization Working Group from 2012-2015. And this already brings us to an important aspect of the problem, which is the role of the internet and the role of new media in the phenomenon of mainstreaming right-wing extremism. Let me also mention that you are now quite heavily involved, Sasha, with some of the big tech giants for trying to curb the phenomenon of radicalization and extremism, right-wing extremism online. So I will mention the Innovation Hub, which is a partnership with Facebook, Google, and Twitter that you have initiated to curb extremism online, and also the Online Civil Courage Initiative in Germany with the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg. You are a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and you have testified before the American Congress on these topics before. So we are very happy to have you on the platform. And then Željko Jovanović, I hope I'm pronouncing your name well. Welcome. You are director of the Open Society Roma Initiatives Office. And again, this leads us to an important aspect of the problem, which is the impact that this all mainstreaming is having on minorities, and particularly the Roma, which we know have been an important target in the Balkan regions, but also more broadly in Central Europe. So your office supports Roma in making their voices heard in policy making. You are also a board chair of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, and you are also a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations and of the Artspen Institute. So two very knowledgeable and competent speakers. I will start, if you agree, with Sasha, and I would ask maybe Sasha to give us a first overview of the problem. How did we get here? What are some of the causes? And maybe some of the potential solutions that you see to kickstart somehow the discussion. The floor is yours, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Federico. Before I start, I just have to say a word of thanks. I'm so delighted and honored to be part of this session at the Belgrade Security Forum, not least because Sonja Licht, the great driver of this initiative, among so many others, is a personal hero of mine, and I think of many of ours. So she is a mentor and a great leader in this space. So thank you so much for having me. Let me just start with a couple of words about maybe what the organization does. I'm sorry, is there a problem with the connection?
I believe we can hear you well, Sasha.
Oh, my apologies. The screen went froze, and I look frozen in it. No, it's okay.
I think you can go ahead. Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry. So let me start by just saying a couple of words about what we do. And then I was asked to say something about why we see this phenomenon of mainstreaming of the far right happening. So ISD, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which I lead, which I set up in 2006, has essentially been at the forefront of analyzing and innovating both policy and operational responses, real world responses to the rising challenge of extremism internationally across the ideological spectrum, from the Islamist to the far right to indeed the hard left variants of this phenomenon. With that, we've developed a data analytics capability as we saw these movements migrate into the online universe and be early adopters of new communications technologies. And so much of our analysis now draws from this computational analysis of the phenomenon of extremism. Why? Why have we mainstreamed so much? When I started to do this work 15 years ago, what we were really told this problem was a set of sort of fringe, unconnected, localized, parochial movements. How did we come this far? There are 5 things, if I may, that I think have contributed to what we are now experiencing, which you've laid out very well yourself, Federico. And so if you permit me, I'd spend, let's say, a minute and a half on each of those 5 things. Number 1 is that we've seen new and effective forms of organization and mobilization. When we started to watch these movements, let's say 10 to 15 years ago, we noted that there was a new form of strategic coordination and organization starting to happen. And increasingly a sort of tactical playbook that was extremely well adapted to the new communication technologies of our time. And we started to see investments. This wasn't by accident. I think we tend to imagine these movements are somehow organic. But it wasn't by accident. We saw investments in what we termed a new far right, a political force, a brand cleansed, more palatable, more electable variant of its street, largely working class predecessor. And at the same time, we started to see an increasing coordination across a fairly broad ideological spectrum, the build out of very potent youth subcultures in this internet online space. And it started to link up, connect the dots across ethno-nationalist, white supremacist, counter-jihad, and conspiracy movements in very new ways. And there was a clear set of tactics to communicate to new audiences with language that would be more palatable to engage with those new audiences. So horses for courses. How do you speak to the normies was one of the things that went around on these transnational fora. They started to translate meme banks and coordinate and sort of send around. It was like the best of an EU policy project. There was a kind of best practice manual sharing in this space that started to happen. And so effectively, the strategy was to mainstream. And they found a host of ways in which to exploit what was essentially a perfect storm of hybrid threats that we were experiencing, and a resultant set of anxieties within our societies. And perhaps we can come to that a little bit later, those push factors alongside the pull factors that we see in play. And so that strategy was to mainstream, and here we are. The second piece of this was essentially the internationalization of nationalism. So part of this new organizational dynamic was the internationalization of these movements, essentially parochial, sort of counterintuitive to this idea that these were sort of small parochial and very hyper-nationalist in their ideology. But what was starting to come into play was transnational globalist narratives around the defense of Christendom, the white man, the West, even liberalism. And so we started to see that take shape. And in some way, this was evidenced, perhaps in the context of the Balkans, most clearly with this awful attack in Christchurch that we saw in March of last year, where Brendan Tarrant, in live streaming the lead up to the attack, you heard a Serb nationalist song playing with roots in the Yugoslav wars. And more recently, that song has been appropriated as a kind of anthem among international alt-right communities. And that could be heard playing in the background of his propaganda video live streamed. And his guns referenced the region. They had the names of historical figures from the Balkans who had resisted Ottoman invasion. And so that framing, as I just said, was part of this idea of the repelling, the resistance against the Islamization of Europe, and a very powerful thing. The third thing is the internet and social media. And we talk about this often in the context of just extremist groups, hate groups being early adopters of these technologies, and indeed they were, and so they could reach further and farther than ever before. But it's not just that. The actual information playing field has been tilted in the interest of extreme and sensationalist messaging. The technological architecture of these platforms we've seen through the design of products, the algorithmic design, is essentially promoting and enclosing people more and more in these types of echo chambers of extreme messaging. In 2016, Facebook did its own internal study of joins to extremist groups on Facebook. And what they found was that 64% of those joins were in fact a result of their own recommendations algorithm. That was leaked 2 years later, but you can understand that these algorithmic challenges now are at the heart of some of the policy work that we're trying to do on a systems-based approach and response to regulating and policy for the governance of this internet space. State actors have come in with their significant propaganda machineries to amplify the content and the networks on the extreme right. I have to say they've played both sides of the aisle. We've seen Kremlin disinformation playing both sides of the aisle, ideologically speaking. But certainly on the far right, there is fertile ground. And research that we did, let's say, on the German federal elections in 2017 showed clearly the confluence of Kremlin and international alt-right networks and content in support of the AfD in the lead up to that election. So you see a kind of increasingly a piggybacking of state influence operations on domestic and also transnational extremist and hate networks. And that is a significant amplification factor. And then finally, I'd just say the failure to respond. I mean, and the failure has been twofold. It is the failure to recognize seriously the nature of the threat. I mean, the far right has been in many ways a blind spot, both to the security services and in many ways constitutes a challenge from a political standpoint. You mentioned the 320% rise in far-right terrorism that the Global Terrorism Index pointed to. We see throughout our research and others' research, we've seen the infiltration of security services, of police, of military by neo-Nazi and extremist groups increasingly. The failure to respond goes deep. That has started to shift in part with the Christchurch call, with Jacinda Ardern's engagement on this issue post-Christchurch. But in effect, you have too little still being done on the threat. And then there's we've failed to muster a strategic response. So far, we look at this set of problems in very siloed ways. We look at the problem of terrorism, we look at the problem of hate speech, we look at the problem of disinformation, state actors, non-state actors, all in distinct silos. But in fact, weaponized hate speech is a tactic of disinformation actors. We saw this very vividly in the analysis of disinformation in the lead up to the European parliamentary elections, where you had essentially a picture of mass weaponization of hate. And disinformation and that grab bag of online tactics that we came to associate with the Kremlin in 2016, 17, so on, is really now in everybody's hands, and especially in the hands of hate and extremist groups. And they utilize these tactics. This is a very, very integrated challenge. And our response to date has failed to be integrated in that regard. And all of this, of course, now in a way amplified through the lens of COVID disinformation, the sort of infodemic that we've seen, massively hypercharging this set of challenges, and not least the conspiracy space. The conspiracy space is live and well, and is in many ways a sort of gateway to this set of problems. And just, in terms of some small research we did in Kumanovo in North Macedonia, interesting in relation to sort of susceptibility to COVID mis and disinformation, 73% of the respondents to a survey that we did locally believe that COVID disinformation, we see the impact of this, has between ethnic communities in Kumanovo. 47% of respondents could not, in fact, identify the correct cause of the emergence and spread of COVID. And there was overall a kind of overconfidence in the ability of people to spot these types of challenges in the online space. So we have a resilience challenge that we're going to need to address. But I haven't talked about what we can do in bigger terms to respond. I'll leave that so that I'm not talking too long and come back maybe in the next set of questions.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I would like to now pass the floor to Željko, but perhaps if you allow me one follow-up question, because there are a lot of things in what you have said we could immediately pick up on, but there is one aspect which I want to pick up on now, because later we can focus on other things, and it's the role of external powers in the mainstreaming of right-wing extremism. You mentioned, of course, the Kremlin role. But I think we have seen that another actor that was quite present in many ways was the Trump movement. We have seen Steve Bannon was quite active, quite unsuccessful overall, but quite active. So maybe a quick follow-up question is, what do you expect? How do you expect the results of the American presidential election to affect the mainstreaming? If Biden wins, are we going to see a setback, in mainstreaming right-wing extremism? Or you think that by now the process is so advanced that transatlantic developments will not affect it in any way?
Yes, I didn't mention that in the context of state actor engagement, because of course it's not state level interference that we're looking at, but it is of course the mobilization of the international alt-right has been absolutely hypercharged by Trump himself, who is one of the best amplifiers of that content, and of course that infrastructure of far right, that new media ecosystem that's been created there. I think it's quite interesting. I do think we see European populists looking to chart their own course. And I do think that these movements have taken hold significantly enough for them to have legs to stand on. And in fact, we see European populists now look in other directions around the world for guidance, for leadership models. That said, of course, it will be a blow, though I think what you will see if Trump doesn't win to that contingent, though what I think you will see is the inflaming of that contingent. The narrative, that disinformation campaign around electoral fraud is extremely strong already now, and we will see it, I think, exacerbated in the lead up to the elections. And so the idea of being unjustly, done out of an opportunity for power is going to be, I think, a mobilizing cry. I worry that that's going to inflame violence, certainly not just in America, but beyond. And so I don't think you'll see the dampening down of these movements, but what you may see is a rethink for the populist piece of this spectrum in terms of where their alliances lie and where they get their inspiration from.
Okay, thank you very much. I will come back to some of these issues later on, but I would now like to ask Željko to give us his perspective, particularly because, as I said, we have been dealing with Roma issues for a long time. And well, this is one of the critical areas, minority rights, Roma rights, but minority rights more broadly, that are at the center of this debate. So the floor is yours. I think we can't hear you. You might be muted. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm like Sasha, very privileged to be part of BSF, and a huge gratitude for Sonia, not only for this, but all the help that she provides to me and our program in the Open Site Foundations. You provided a very useful framework with your 3 points at the beginning, in addition about Kremlin's role, Russia's role in Europe to amplify and help mainstreaming of the far right and right-wing extremism. But I would offer a different perspective, not only how Roma are affected by far right and right-wing extremism, but how they are used as a tool for both Russia and mainstreaming of far right in Europe. I would start with reminding all of us how U.S. Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris pointed out that racism is a national security issue because Russia exploited the influence in the American politics and in particular last US elections through the pervasive racism in the American society. Similarly, in Europe, we have the same vulnerability that Russia and right-wing extremists exploit. And in that context, I would like to talk about the Roma and the biggest minority of 12 million people dispersed across the continent, 6 to 8 million in the EU, who are the poorest and most politically neglected minority that most citizens have negative prejudice about. And in other words, weaponization of the prejudice against the Roma is basically a low-cost, high-impact business because it works everywhere and nobody cares to respond. So unlike in the US, the European security officials and experts do not realize that the situation of Roma has been and still is a very potent tool, a very potent instrument for both right-wing extremism and the Russian hybrid warfare in Europe. As we know, the hybrid warfare and new generation warfare pursued by Russia aims to undermine European countries from within by deepening political divides. And as part of this larger undertaking, Russia found a convenience in supporting the right-wing populists and far-right extremists in Europe who embrace the Kremlin's model of illiberal democracy. Now, in the Kremlin's playbook, weakening of social cohesion is key. And as we know, the cohesion between Roma and non-Roma in European countries has never been strong, to say the least, and has never been a political priority. That's exactly why this gives a fertile ground for the security threats from the far-right extremists and Russia together. But we have to recognize that neither Russia nor the far-right created the problems that Roma live through. It is a local organic product made of failed promises of political accountability. And this has been done by national pro-European elites, centrist liberal governments over the last 30 years. As they aspire to join the EU, many governments pledged commitments to improve the situation of Roma, but they didn't deliver. Most of the policies and projects have failed, and even the EU Roma policy on Roma has failed by simply looking at the facts that 8 out of 10 Roma today live below their country's threshold for poverty, and 3 out of 10 live without tap water in 21st century Europe. And the reason for this is quite basic and really ruthlessly simple. The governments have not had the political will, or to better say, maybe courage to do that, because they are afraid that whatever they do positive for Roma is contrary to the views of their electorate. Just for illustration, Eurostat shows us that discrimination against Roma is widespread. It's practically on the top of their ranking in Europe, not only relative to other ethnic minorities, but also to sexual and religious minorities, as well as youth and women. The countries like Italy, Slovakia, Greece, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, record unfavorable views against the Roma between 81 and 61%, while favorable views are only between 14 to 28%. So liberal politicians showed political weakness in front of these unfavorable views, but the populists and the far right use them ruthlessly to gain and grow political power. So in the aftermath of 2008 financial crisis, when we saw and still see anxiety and anger much intensified, they used Roma to frame them as a threat and problem for the problems of the majority, and all the policies that were positive towards the Roma, they framed them as a privilege of the Roma and disadvantage of the majority. So this was the playbook for far-right and right-wing extremists to gain power, especially when they were in their startup phase. For example, Jobbik in Hungary started with almost exclusive anti-Roma agenda. We also know this from People's Party, Our Slovakia, as well as Lega Nord in Italy. But also centrist political parties like Fidesz or Smer, or a decade ago, Forza Italia, used anti-Roma prejudice, anti-Roma racism to consolidate power. So these developments gave also ground for far-right terrorism against the Roma in the form of paramilitary marches, like Magyar Garda in Hungary, or aggressive violent protests against the Roma, like Casa Pond in Italy. We also saw violence and killings. For example, in 2009, Robert Csorba was a Hungarian Roma man. He and his son were killed in a city southeast of Budapest. During the night, their home was set on fire, and as parents were trying to save the children from the flames, they were killed by the far-right militia. But this violence, brutality, and killings didn't grow more empathy or didn't decrease negative sentiment on the majority. In more than a decade, we haven't seen that. But what we did see, that far right became part of the European political mainstream. So this is where and when the far right gained more power by weaponizing the negative sentiment against the Roma, especially after the 2014 elections, and became part of European political and social mainstream. They became, through the violence and killings, a domestic security threat. And as your Federico's Martens Center showed, they created an unholy alliance with Russia to exercise influence on the European Union and NATO, actually playing into and for the Russian geopolitical interests, which makes the whole configuration also an external security threat. So in this context, I would like to highlight in this discussion that Roma are not only the victims, but instruments for the mainstream of the far right and for Russian hybrid warfare. And this is where I think European security officials as well as experts are short-sighted to see Roma only as somehow poverty issue and human rights issue, not as an element in the security protection of national and European interests. So I would stop here and maybe talk as well as Sasha a little bit later about what needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Željko, for that nice overview. Maybe let me jump in immediately with picking up on an issue you said. Now, obviously, one of the victims, in a way, of mainstreaming right-wing extremism of this process has been the European Union and the European integration process, which has been attacked very heavily as encroaching upon national identities. It is a privileged target of far-right, extremism. At the same time, I mean, for some people, the EU is also part of the solution to some of the issues we are facing. And you mentioned that the EU Roma strategy has failed. And I wanted to ask you why you think it has failed, and if you could explain to us how, if you think the EU could do more and better in addressing one specific negative consequence of the mainstreaming of right-wing extremism, which is the negative impact on the Roma population. What can the EU do here? And can this be generalized to add to the protection of other minorities that are threatened by this process of mainstreaming?
Let me start from the end of your question, whether this is relevant for protection of others. Certainly. if we follow the logic that by protecting the most vulnerable, the most weak, we protect the whole. So certainly. But as I said at the beginning, the Roma are practically the most hated, the most disliked minority traditionally in Europe. And that is kind of a mainstream feeling. And this is how that mainstream feeling was used for mainstreaming of the far right. The reason why I say the European policies as well as significant funding has failed is simply that we don't see macroeconomic changes after 30 years of the different kind of investments in the situation of Roma. But things changed dramatically in two instances. First instance was when a country joins the European Union. It doesn't have any more incentives to show anything in terms of commitment to the Roma, because it's not part anymore of the candidacy criteria, Copenhagen criteria on human minority rights. So the governments not being candidates but actually being decision makers lose interest in doing anything positive for the Roma. Second was the financial crisis that practically created an environment in which the governments had a legitimate excuse to say that they need to cut public spending. European policies, austerity policies went exactly in that direction. So governments would say we cannot afford investing in education, in employment, in infrastructure, and so on. So the situation of Roma deteriorated. Even those who had some jobs lost them. So basically these two moments were critical. And then we have the third moment, which is 2015, when migration crisis broke, when the kind of negative attitudes against minorities, especially against the Muslims, kind of heightened the hate against diverse groups, colored people, Muslims in societies generally. And that also legitimized and further enhanced this kind of attitude and political campaigning against the Roma too.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to go back to Sasha for a moment. Sasha, your first intervention, in fact interventions, because there was my follow-up question, gave us a nice overview of some of the causes of the phenomenon. We have not touched upon all of them. Maybe we can consider some additional ones later. But I would like for a moment to fast forward to some of the solutions. One of your points, the fifth point, was failure to respond. We were not capable in addressing timely some of the negative developments on the ground. And so my question now is, can you formulate a positive agenda, or how do you see the way out? What would be your action points in terms of solution? How can we tackle some of the problems that we have been unable to address so far?
In the first place, we need to be singing from the same hymn sheet, which means that we need to have a common data picture of the threat. What's interesting to me is that you have parts of certain governments, certain intergovernmental institutions, the EAS, for instance, the G7's disinfo team, doing very interesting and good work on a partial sighted view of the problem, which is to say, most of these institutions and most governments are mandated to look, for instance, at the role of the disinformation problem from the perspective of hostile state actors, foreign state actors, but aren't mandated to follow that threat through into the domestic space, into the non-state actor space, and into the domestic political sphere. So you have a partial sight of the problem. So as I said, you need to be connecting the dots across our understanding of violent extremism, terrorism, disinformation, and hate speech, in particular as it relates to this new information ecosystem online, This is absolutely possible. So in the first place, we need to establish data infrastructure to be able in real time to identify and to track the way in which these movements are developing and how they're influencing our societies. We've been building out those capabilities, and others, academic institutions and other partners are working together to try and paint that picture. But we need that shared in an easy to use way across the constituencies that need to be responding strategically to that threat. So that needs to be shared within the policy and within the civic sectors in a much, much more effective way than is currently the case. That should be the baseline for our strategic response. The second thing is that we need to be looking at internet governance in new ways. Up until now, the focus of government policies and regulation where it's existed, for instance, in Germany or in France, has largely been on content moderation or removal. So looking at this set of challenges really from the perspective of the removal of illegal content. But this set of challenges, as I said, is a vast one, and the gray area is big here. This doesn't all boil down to either explicitly violent content or violence inciting content or messaging. It's much more subtle than that. And in fact, these groups and movements are very adept at towing the line, or just sitting at the line in order to be able to obviate the rules online and off. And so really, the need that we have is for a systems-based approach to regulation. What we see is these platforms being gamed in many ways, but also the technological architecture, the products and the algorithms of the platforms essentially commercializing engagement with extreme and sensationalized content. The impact of that is huge because the amplification of that across these spaces, which of course have massive amounts of users, not least of course on youth subcultures, is massive. So the EU, you mentioned, of course, is in a position to do something really meaningful beyond GDPR under the auspices of the Digital Services Act, but it needs to go beyond content moderation to a kind of duty of care for the systems and practices of these companies that amplify, that distort the level playing field, if you like, of speech, to be addressed. So that in fact, we're in a position then to genuinely outcompete the bad with good, to compete with these ideas in the information ecosystem. That can't happen if it is essentially geared up against us, if it is unfairly tilted in the interest of these types of groups. So digital regulation, platform governance is a big part of this, I believe. Finally, I would say there is, we need to get our political systems under control. What's been fascinating to me is doing the computational analysis of disinformation in the lead up to elections. And it's not that this is happening only in those contexts, but those are, of course, great points of vulnerability and opportunity for these groups, is the extent to which you have increasingly political parties or the fan clubs of political parties engage in bad behaviors online, in deceptive and bad behaviors, the sorts of things, again, that we saw in the Kremlin playbook. False accounts, fake communities, fake popularity, essentially. That set of tools now is in the hands of political parties so often. And of course, I believe we should be regulating this, but in the first place, we should be asking mainstream political parties to come to the table to make commitments around the ways in which the digital space the ways in which they use the digital space for political campaigning. We need a cleaner approach to political campaigning in the digital era. And those are commitments I think we can ask of mainstream political parties. And then we can see them isolate bad behaviors within fringe parties in a more effective way. Right now, we see some of those bad behaviors within the mainstream. And so it creates a permissive environment for all sorts of groups to come into that space. Finally, the far right needs to be taken seriously from a security standpoint in the many, many places in which it is now mobilizing in very, very real ways where there is real threat. That started to happen in small ways in certain countries, but it's certainly not happening consistently. And that requires us, as Željko says, to understand this from a geostrategic standpoint, and to understand what kind of geopolitical vulnerability that opens up for our societies if we enable this to fester. There is a massive problem now on the rise within certain contexts of radicalization and recruitment within the police, within the military. These things have to be addressed very, very, very rapidly, and that requires political will, and it requires us to think strategically. In a way, the real challenge is that the far right operates from a terrorist perspective from a post-organizational standpoint. And so the proscribing of terrorist groups in the way that has happened in other terrorist contexts, including the Islamist space, it's difficult to do effectively across the far right, as we see these movements really operate in a post-organizational way. And so again, we're going to need more nimble and more creative solutions to that part of the problem. But we do need the political will to be there in order to stamp this out. The fact that it touches often on nationalist mobilization, on political mobilization, makes this extremely challenging. And these groups play on that very effectively.
I jump in just to say that, of course, I mean, we are having discussion now at the European level on an EU system for removing extremist content online. But of course, we all know, I'm not saying anything new here, that this opens up Pandora's box in terms of how do you balance curbing hate speech and extreme content versus ensuring, free speech in a way. And it made me think while I was listening to you, I remember an incident last week when you probably all have seen that, when Donald Trump's Twitter account was suspended for some time. And to an extent, I understand what's going on, but it also makes me shiver a little bit as a liberal, as someone who believes in freedom of speech, that we are moving into a society potentially in which, for the sake of curbing hate speech, social platforms will be empowered to silence the president of the United States of America. And that is not even the worst part, because Trump is so prominent that we immediately noticed that he had been silenced. There are many Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith, which are not far less known. And how do you strike the balance there? I fear a bit the direction in which we are going.
So I think this is really important. It's a false dichotomy, free speech versus censorship. If we strike the right policy approach, as I said, we need to go beyond content moderation and content removal. That isn't going to get us where we need to be. And it hits up against all of these problems that you just raise in relation to free speech. We don't want the companies to be making decisions around what is acceptable or not in terms of speech. Of course, there's a layer of content that I think in most of our societies we would deem illegal, from child sexual exploitation to, let's say, beheading videos, explicit violence. But for the rest, the approach shouldn't be the removal simply of content. It shouldn't be to ask the companies to do wholesale, automated, swift removal, which is what many countries and part of the EU is asking for. Instead, it needs to be to look at how content gets distributed, how it gets curated by the companies in a way to distort that content, to amplify it in ways that may be harmful for users. And so this is really about rebalancing the playing field for free speech. We're talking about the difference between organic content and speech and inorganic content and speech. What we want to stop is the inorganic manipulation, distortion, amplification of speech through the systems, the technological systems of these platforms. That's something that we need to be regulating. But it isn't about organic speech. It's about the inorganic distribution systems for that speech that can distort the information playing field. We need to be really careful about that and really clear. And so an approach that we've been promoting in the UK within the Online Harms Bill in the United Kingdom, and that I think is having some traction at a European level now, is a duty of care approach, where the companies would be essentially made responsible for the design of their algorithms, their systems, the decision-making behind those algorithms and products and systems in relation to how they may impact harms in this way, in this systemic way, how their curation impacts harm, how their curation distorts content, as opposed to being asked to just remove in automated ways massive amounts of content.
Thank you very much. I find that distinction between organic and inorganic speech quite interesting, but unfortunately I don't think we have time to elaborate too much on that. I would like to now ask, there is a question actually from the audience on the Roma question, but I'm not entirely sure I understand it. So I will read it to you, and then maybe I will add some questions on my own, and you can decide to reply as you wish. So it's from Marina Kerber, and she's writing that you said that Roma were the most hated in Europe, but that she disagrees about that. And although she cannot say who is really the most hated, probably depends on the group you are inquiring. She's asking you, I would like to know who is the most hated by Roma. I don't understand whether this is a polemic question or, but anyway, I mean, I'm passing the question to you, and you can decide to reply as you deem fit. Maybe I will add one additional question on my own as well. Could you comment? I mean, this is really, we are touching upon a very delicate aspect, right? This balance between free speech and censoring hate speech. So, what is your stance, and how does this apply to the Roma problem specifically?
Yeah. So I think I will just restate what I said earlier, that we need to really think about the principle that this is not about the Roma, but it is about the group that has been instrumentalized because it is in the most vulnerable position. So by protecting the Roma, we are not only doing something good for Roma, we are actually protecting European security and national security interests. On the who is most hated, I'm simply citing a scientific research done by Eurostat, because that is relevant for the topic and for understanding the influence of how we got the fringe parochial movements, in the words of Sasha, becoming a major political force in Europe. I would like to address your question, Federico, in just a couple of points, thinking about solutions. Some of them are similar to Sasha's, some of them are not. So I think, first of all, the European Union and national governments should stop hurting themselves. So besides what should be done, we also need to think about what needs to be stopped, what shouldn't be done anymore. So first thing that I would suggest that should be stopped and not done anymore, because it is self-harm, is that national security agencies stop confusing the Roma as a tool with the Roma as a source of security risks, because Roma are framed in a number of countries as actually a security risk group, as a source. And this is historically unfounded because Roma have never engaged in any armed conflict for our own sake. We did fought for the armies of our governments and countries, but not for our own cause. But most importantly for today, by securitizing the Roma, the governments actually reinforce the message of the far right and populist. And this is how they harm their own security interests from internal and external point of view. The EU as well, recently we found out that the European Union actually financed projects for police training on radicalization of Roma in Bulgaria. We also discovered a few days ago that the European Union financed Holocaust deniers. So these are really self-inflicting wounds and self-inflicting risks. As Sasha mentioned, the security agencies themselves maybe react in this way because they are really infiltrated by the far right, and the debate that's going on in Germany needs to be expanded Europe-wise to see really what is the impact of the far right on the security agencies, the police, army, and so on. We see also part of the solution also in recent weeks with court cases against the Golden Dawn and the leaders of the neo-Nazi party in Slovakia, Kotleba. They were persecuted, but I think this is only the tip of the iceberg, because while you remove the leaders of the party or the whole party, we do not remove the risks stemming from the social inequalities and the external influences that create underlying system for the same phenomena, same players to recur in different and actually more advanced forms. I also see part of the solution in the very strong statements in Germany after the extremism and actually terrorist acts of the far right that took place, I think, in February, where the whole German leadership, the president of the parliament, minister of interior, and Chancellor Merkel, they had very strong statements basically saying far right is the biggest threat for rule of law and democracy in Germany. That needs to be the discourse and politics of the political leaders in our countries. National and international monitoring and the action of prevention among the security agencies, Sasha already mentioned some of it in the digital space. In my conversations with security experts, for example, Interpol has no mandate to do this if it's not instructed by the member states. So again, we need to look at our governments and what the governments need to do. Finally, Sasha mentioned elections and how important they are in the cycles of disinformation and far-right campaigning. In the case of Roma, this is really, really important, because we see that the spikes of campaigning against the Roma and iterations of violence against the Roma for the purpose of gaining votes actually happen before elections, whether this is from the center-right populists or the far-right. We saw this in Italy, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, and Hungary. So I think we need to have a complex overview of what needs to be done exclusively in the security domain, what needs to be done in political domain, and what needs to be done in broader social and cultural domain. And the forums like this are important because at least people that speak in this kind of forums need to look at the situation of Roma, as I said, not only through the lenses of poverty and human rights, but see them as vital for the interests of the countries, both in the sense of economics, but also security.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think that is. If you have any sort of concluding remarks, please, the floor is yours, but rapidly, because I'm afraid we need to wrap it up.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, sort of action. I mean, sure. There's two things. Center-right political parties have an extremely important role to play here in distancing themselves clearly from the narrative and from the mobilization of the far right, number one. Number two, the EU, where is its enforcement of its own rules and values within its member states? We need to find a way to have the EU enforce properly the rules and the values that are enshrined in those rules within the EU, or we risk making a mockery of the whole thing. And Brexit will be the least of the worries for the EU, ultimately. But when you see populist parties becoming, of course, increasingly effective in electoral terms and come into governments, the entire integrity of the EU is put into question, and its ability to respond to these threats internally, while, you know, waxing lyrical about external threats.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think this is an excellent concluding statement. So let me just summarize. It's impossible to summarize, of course, but I think, well, we have ascertained that there was for a long time a certain failure to act. So there is now a need to catch up on that, and to take immediate actions. Some of the things that were suggested, let me recap them. First of all, firm repression of all illegal action. You were mentioning Golden Dawn, you know, in the trial, but also developing a new form of internet governance. This was, and then third aspect, the euro. Very important, the euro enforcing its own values within, projecting its own values outside. Maybe the last point that I would like to make is let's not fool ourselves. There are some serious dilemmas that we have not solved yet in terms of balancing, as I was saying, free speech versus curbing hate speech, but also understanding, making sure that different ideological sensitivities are not curbed and that there is a spectrum of a pluralism of opinion that is still preserved. But that said, I would really like to thank the organizers for the invitation, the speakers for their excellent contributions, and obviously we have not finished. This is an important conversation that we will continue in other fora, and our organizations will continue to collaborate together in defense of these important values and actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the online panel of the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. We will be back soon.